the last enemy fleet surrendered before he finished his coffee, which was irritating for several reasons, the first being that he had only just gotten the temperature right. He stood at the command deck, watching hundreds of warships power down like obedient machines that had suddenly remembered fear, and sighed in a way that made his crew exchange quiet glances. One of them leaned over and whispered that the commander looked more disappointed than victorious again, which had become a pattern no one knew how to fix. He lifted the cup, took a slow sip, and muttered that if the universe insisted on collapsing so easily, it could at least have the courtesy to wait until he enjoyed his drink. "Are you always this dramatic?" A voice asked from behind him, calm, almost amused, and entirely out of place in a secured warship that required 17 layers of authorization just to breathe. He turned, not startled, which was either a sign of his experience or a concerning lack of self-preservation, and saw her standing there as if she had always belonged in that exact spot. She looked human, unsettlingly so, with the kind of presence that made people instinctively pay attention, but her long ears curved slightly backward, catching the faint glow of distant stars in a way that made them impossible to ignore. She tilted her head, examining him as though he were the unexpected variable in her calculations. "You bypassed my entire defense system," he said, not accusing, just mildly curious. "That's either impressive or very inconvenient." "It's neither," she replied, stepping closer with an ease that suggested she had already decided he was not a threat, which he found both insulting and interesting. "You've been winning wars. I've been doing something else." He gestured vaguely at the silent battlefield outside. "This is what happens when I get bored. What exactly have you been doing that lets you walk into my ship like you own it?" "Creating dragons," she said, as if she had just announced something entirely reasonable, like adjusting a navigation route. He blinked once, slowly. "I'm going to need you to elaborate, because I'm fairly certain dragons are not currently part of any known military classification." "They're not weapons," she said, and there was a faint hint of humor in her voice, as though she already anticipated his next assumption. "At least, not primarily." "Of course," he muttered, "that makes it better." Before he could continue, something small and glowing drifted into the room through what should have been a solid wall, as if the concept of barriers had politely stepped aside. It circled lazily in the air, shimmering with shifting colors, and then let out a tiny burst of flame that dissipated harmlessly before touching anything important. He stared at it, then at her, then back at it. "That," he said carefully, "is either the most dangerous thing I've ever seen or the least concerned creature in existence." "It's both," she replied. "It wanted to see you." The creature hovered closer to him, tilting its head in a way that felt suspiciously like curiosity, then flicked its tail and opened a brief tear in space that snapped shut a second later with a soft sound, like a door being politely closed. He lowered his coffee, now completely forgot. "It just did that accidentally, didn't it?" "It's still learning," she said, and for a moment there was something almost proud in her tone. He exhaled slowly, a faint smile forming despite himself. "I spent years mastering war, and now I'm being introduced to reality-breaking lizards that ignore walls." "Dragons," she corrected gently. "Right," he said. "Dragons. I assume they don't follow orders either. They follow curiosity." He looked at the tiny creature again as it attempted to chase a reflection of itself in the polished surface of the control panel, nearly opening another rift in the process. For the first time in a long while, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, something that wasn't strategy or certainty. "Good," he said finally, taking another sip of now lukewarm coffee, "because I'm starting to think orders are overrated." The creature decided the control panel was boring and immediately opened a thin, shimmering tear in the air, as casually as someone opening a window for fresh air. Except the fresh air appeared to be a dimension filled with floating geometric shapes that pulsed like they had opinions. The man stared at it, then at his crew, who had collectively decided to freeze in place and pretend none of this required paperwork. "It did it again," he said, very calmly, which was how he sounded when things were absolutely not calm. "It's curious," she replied, watching the small dragon lean halfway into the rift as if considering whether to invite the shapes inside. "You were curious once too, weren't you?" "I was curious about tactics," he said. "Not whatever that is. I never opened a hole in reality just to check if something on the other side looked interesting. That sounds like a missed opportunity. The dragon chirped softly, then slipped fully through the tier. He blinked. It just left. It'll come back. That's not reassuring. Without another word, he set his cup down, which his crew immediately recognized as a sign that things were about to become complicated. He stepped forward and, after a brief pause that suggested he was reconsidering every life choice that had led him here, walked into the rift. On the other side, space refused to behave. There was no clear direction, no sense of up or down, just drifting clusters of luminous shapes that rotated slowly as if they were thinking very hard about something. The small dragon hovered nearby, happily circling one of the clusters, occasionally tapping it with its nose and producing ripples that spread like laughter through the void. "This is why I prefer enemies that shoot at me," he muttered, carefully adjusting his stance even though there was nothing to stand on. She stepped through behind him without hesitation, her long ears catching faint pulses of light that seemed to react to her presence. "Relax, it's harmless." One of the shapes abruptly stretched, then folded into a new form that looked suspiciously like an attempt at imitation. Another followed, and soon several of them were reshaping themselves into vague, shifting outlines that resembled the man, though with unnecessary extra limbs and what he was fairly certain was an artistic interpretation of his hair. He stared. "Are they mocking me?" "They're learning," she said, and there was that hint of amusement again. "I don't like being educational material." The dragon darted between the shapes, clearly delighted, and let out a small burst of flame that didn't burn, but instead caused the surrounding forms to scatter and reform in brighter colors. One of them drifted closer to the man and extended something like a limb, gently tapping his shoulder before quickly retracting as if embarrassed. He sighed. "I conquer galaxies, and now I'm being politely poked by sentient geometry." "You're adapting well. I refuse to accept that this counts as adaptation." The dragon suddenly tilted its head, then rushed toward a distant point where the space itself seemed thinner, like a surface stretched too far. Without warning, it exhaled another flicker of flame, and a second tier opened, larger this time, revealing a glimpse of a star-filled expanse beyond. He narrowed his eyes. "That one doesn't look harmless." "It's not," she said quietly. For a moment, the shapes around them dimmed, as if they too recognized the shift. The dragon hovered at the edge of the new rift, excited but uncertain, glancing back at them as though asking permission it had no intention of waiting for. He stepped forward, expression sharpening into something more familiar, though not quite the same as before. "So this is where your explorers get into trouble. This is where everything does." He glanced at her, then at the dragon, then back at the widening tier. A faint smile touched his lips, equal parts anticipation and disbelief. "Good," he said. "I was starting to miss problems that don't surrender immediately." The tier widened like something deciding to become a door, and the small dragon hovered at its edge, vibrating with excitement that bordered on irresponsibility. He stepped closer, expecting the familiar tension of battle to settle into his bones, but instead he felt something lighter, something almost curious, which he immediately blamed on prolonged exposure to impossible reptiles. "If this goes badly," he said, "I'm officially blaming your entire species." "They don't have a species yet," she replied. "You're watching it happen." "That's not comforting." The dragon chirped and darted through the opening without waiting, leaving a brief trail of light that flickered like laughter. He exhaled once, then followed, because apparently that was who he was now, someone who walked into unstable dimensions after creatures that did not understand consequences. The other side did not greet them with silence. It pulsed. Space bent inward and outward as if breathing, and in the distance something vast shifted, not quite visible, but unmistakably aware. The dragon hovered in front of it, smaller than a thought compared to whatever filled the horizon, yet entirely unafraid. "Well," he muttered, "that's new. Usually the terrifying unknown at least pretends to be subtle." The presence moved, and reality rippled with it. A shape began to form, not fixed, not stable, like an idea struggling to decide what it wanted to be. When it focused on the dragon, the space around them tightened, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. "It sees them," she said quietly. "It sees everything," he replied, though his voice lacked the certainty it once carried. The dragon tilted its head, then did something that made him instinctively reach for a weapon he no longer felt the need to use. It split. Not violently, not painfully, but effortlessly, becoming two smaller forms that circled each other, glowing brighter. The presence reacted, pulling back slightly as if confused. "That's not normal," he said. "It's growth," she answered, though even she sounded surprised. The two dragons darted forward, not attacking, not retreating, but exploring, weaving through the shifting edges of the entity. Wherever they moved, the distortions softened, patterns forming where there had been only chaos. The immense presence shifted again, slower this time, less certain. He watched, lowering his guard in a way that would have horrified his former self. "They're not fighting it, they're understanding it." One of the dragons paused, then emitted a soft pulse of light that spread outward, touching the vast shape. For a moment, everything stilled. Then the presence began to change, its edges smoothing, its movements losing their tension, as if something ancient had just remembered how to relax. He let out a quiet breath. "I've spent years forcing things to surrender." "And now?" she asked. He watched the dragons circle the once threatening entity, now calmer, almost curious in return. "Now I'm watching something teach the universe how to behave without destroying it first." She smiled faintly, her long ears catching the steady glow that now filled the space. That was always the point. One of the dragons zipped back toward them, splitting again mid-flight into three smaller ones that immediately began chasing each other in a chaotic spiral. He blinked. "They're multiplying. They're exploring faster." That's one way to describe it. He looked around, at the stabilizing dimension, at the vast entity slowly drifting away without hostility, and finally at her. For the first time, there was no battle to plan, no victory to secure. Just an open path, unpredictable and absurd. He picked up his now entirely cold coffee from where it had somehow followed him through reality, took a sip, and grimaced. "I used to measure success by how quickly things ended." And now, he watched the dragons, now 5, possibly 6. He was losing count, opening tiny harmless tears and darting through them like children discovering doors for the first time. "Now," he said, a quiet smile forming, "I think I prefer seeing where things go." She stepped beside him, and together they watched as the dragons leapt from one forming path to another, each new opening revealing fragments of worlds not yet known. Without another word, they followed not as conquerors, not as creators alone, but as something in between, leaving behind a universe that no longer needed saving, and stepping into one that didn't need to be fought at all. The paths the dragons opened no longer looked like accidents. They curved with intention, overlapping like threads being woven by minds that had never learned to hesitate. He stepped through one of them without checking where it led, which would have been unthinkable not long ago, and found himself standing on something that behaved like ground out of sheer politeness. Above him, a sky rearranged its stars every few seconds, as if undecided about aesthetics. "Do they ever choose a destination?" he asked, watching 3 of the smaller dragons argue midair by circling each other faster and faster, or do they just improvise forever? "They follow patterns we don't see yet," she said, her voice calm, though her eyes tracked every movement with quiet pride. "Or maybe they're making the patterns." That sounds suspiciously like an excuse for chaos. One of the dragons swooped down and dropped something at his feet. It looked like a fragment of light folded into a solid shape, humming faintly. He crouched, picked it up, and raised an eyebrow. "Did it just bring me a gift from another reality?" "It likes you," she said. "It has terrible judgment." The fragment flickered, projecting a brief image into the air. His ship, his crew, the silent battlefield from before, now distant and irrelevant. The image shifted, showing the crew moving again, no longer frozen by uncertainty, but adapting, exploring the abandoned war zone with cautious curiosity. He stared at it longer than he expected. "They're fine. They always were. I used to think they needed me to win," he said, almost to himself. "Turns out they just needed me to stop ending everything before it began." She stepped closer, her long ears catching the shifting light as the sky above settled into a slower rhythm. "And you needed something you couldn't control." He gave a quiet, almost reluctant laugh. "I still don't control any of this." "Exactly." A sudden ripple passed through the space, not violent, but firm, like a boundary being gently reinforced. In the distance, the vast presence they had encountered earlier drifted into view again, no longer distorted, its form smoother, defined by calm rather than tension. It paused, acknowledging them in a way that didn't require words, then continued on its path, leaving behind a stable wake that the dragons eagerly explored. They fixed it, he said. They helped it fix itself. Even worse, he replied. Now I have to accept that not everything needs a decisive victory. A cluster of dragons, he counted 7, then lost track when 2 split into 4, spiraled upward, opening a larger path that revealed a cascade of worlds layered over each other like reflections. Forests growing in zero gravity, cities built on moving light, oceans that flowed upward into the sky. The scale of it would have once triggered a plan, a strategy, a need to conquer or defend. Now it just made him smile. So, he said, glancing at her, we follow them, let them tear open reality wherever they feel like, and hope nothing tries to erase us. She considered that, more or less, that's the least responsible plan I've ever agreed to. And yet you agreed. He looked at the dragons again, at the paths stretching endlessly ahead, and then at the fragment of light still in his hand. With a small motion, he let it dissolve, trusting the image didn't need to be held onto. I spent my life closing things, he said. Wars, threats, possibilities. He exhaled lighter now. I think I'm done with that. She nodded, as if this had always been inevitable. One of the dragons darted back, hovering between them, then split once more, becoming 2 identical sparks of motion that circled their heads impatiently before rushing toward the largest opening. He watched them go, then stepped forward without hesitation. No more victories, he said, almost amused by the idea. No more endings, she replied, just whatever comes next. They walked together into the expanding path, surrounded by creatures that refused to recognize limits, leaving behind a universe that no longer defined them. And as the dragons surged ahead, multiplying, exploring, reshaping everything they touched, he realized he wasn't leading anymore. And for the first time, that felt exactly right.